There's currently no more difficult volunteer job than being on the board of a community hospital. And because of that, you see lots and lots of complicated things come across the board desk when you're having your meetings. Hopefully, this video will provide you with some information that's very helpful to you during those meetings about what's happening in Topeka and the Kansas Legislature.
Wanted to talk with you a little bit about some of the activities that we're anticipating for this upcoming session and give you a little bit of background as to the movers and shakers, the leaders within our legislature as well as on the state level, but then talk with you about a couple of the key issues. One, the tax exempt status, which is an issue that percolated at the end of last legislative session, a couple other items, and then wrap it up with expansion. Between April 1st and April 27th, that will be the interim break that our state lawmakers will be back in their home communities. And this is a great opportunity for you to reach out to them and bring them back to your hospital and talk with them about those issues that are remaining and that need to be addressed during the veto session, which will start around April 27th and can last a few days depending on where they're at with the state budget, or it could be like last year where the veto session lasted longer than a month because they could not figure out how to get the right mix of taxes as well as budget cuts to balance the budget for last fiscal year. When we look at the legislative leadership, the leadership has not changed from last session. Over on the Senate side, we have Senator Susan Wagle. Many of you are well aware of Senator Wagle's interest in health care. She has been a staunch proponent of hospitals and has worked very closely with us. And in fact, a couple years ago, she received the Advocate Award on behalf of our association, and so someone that we work very closely with. The majority leader is Senator Terry Bruce. Senator Bruce is from Hutchinson, Kansas. He's an attorney. He's the one who sets the agenda, what it will happen on the Senate floor. And so he's very important in that regards to ensure that he has at least some willingness to engage in issues that we're willing to address and try to get on the floor. On the House side, you have Speaker Ray Merrick. Speaker Merrick is in his last term as Speaker, and so this will be his last year as Speaker of the House. It's not anticipated that he's going to run for re-election, and so he has been one of the outspoken critics of expansion. Representative Gene Vickery is the majority leader, and just like Senator Bruce, he addresses what will happen on the House floor in terms of debates, and so he's someone that is instrumental as well in our discussions. When we look at our state legislature, we have 165 members of the Kansas House, of which there are 40 senators, 125 House members. Out of the 40 senators, we have 32 Republicans and 8 Democrats. When you look at the 125 representatives that we have 93 Republicans and 32 Democrats. Key to this, though, is that this is an election year. And so we will see lots of interesting bills that will be introduced this year, mainly for the purpose of candidates or legislators being able to go back home and say, I introduced a bill that would do A, B, or C. A couple of the other items that we do anticipate from a hospital perspective or a healthcare perspective that will get some discussions besides hopefully expansion. The Healthcare Access Improvement Panel, which is the program that our hospitals have been engaged in since 2004, where we assess our PPS hospitals to draw down funds on the federal level to help support Medicaid payments to hospitals and physicians. At the end of last legislative session, there were a proposal that came out of the governor's office to raise our assessment, which is at 1.83% of net patient revenue on the PPS hospitals. The proposal was to raise that above 2%. That was rejected from the legislature with the help of many of you in this room today. And so we do anticipate, however, is that there is interest in revisiting this issue and looking at whether or not the program is working at a level that it should be working and whether it's sustainable. There are discussions going on now with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. In addition, CanCare implementation, we're now in the 4th year of the CanCare program. You may recall originally when this was created that the CanCare program provided contracts out to the 3 managed care companies of a 3-year contract with 2 one-year extensions. We're in the 1st year of the 1-year extensions. There's still obviously obstacles and hurdles that have been placed in front of our healthcare providers, including hospitals. I know Tish on our staff has worked with many of you, as well as with a CanCare Oversight Committee that we have internally with KHA, as well as the Legislative Oversight Committee to talk about some of these obstacles to see if we can get some of those issues addressed. There are new changes coming to the CanCare program as it relates to the contracts between the state as well as the MCOs. Unfortunately, at this point in time, we haven't seen the final contracts that the state has entered into with the MCOs. But this is the biggest issue that our legislature has to deal with. This is why they have been elected. This is what their main purpose is to come in and to provide a budget that is sustainable. Theoretically, they're supposed to have a 7.5% ending balance. We typically have not met that over the last several years, but they are to come in and help plan the state expenditures and revenues that will be coming in. And so here we are again in an election year with our state legislators. All 165 are up for re-election. And so now we're facing not only a deficit in 2017, but also a deficit in the current year, 2016. So what's the way to balance that? Well, either you somehow cut more state expenditures or you raise taxes. And so what do you think the choice is of our legislature for an election year? It's probably not to raise taxes. And so that's the big 800-pound gorilla that's in the room, the $64,000 question as to how do we balance this without raising taxes. So what we will see most likely are some disagreements among many of our legislators. Some of them want to go back and look at the LLC tax exemption that was provided a few years ago. Some of them do want to look at reducing the state expenditures. And in fact, at the end of the 2016-15 session, the legislature did provide funding to have an audit conducted that would look at the expenditures of the state of Kansas. You may have seen in the media recently that the report has been out from this organization that talked about some of the efficiencies that could be made. As you look at the Medicaid side, I think a couple of key items percolated to the top, one of which they talked about getting more federal grants into the state of Kansas, which is interesting to note, especially since that's been one of the pushbacks that we've had from the legislature is to get more federal dollars to come in the state. But the other aspect that was key within the report, from my perspective, is that they've identified that the state of Kansas should be leveraging more federal resources and dollars to come in to help offset state expenditures. Now, one small program was not included in that, which is this whole issue of expansion. And so there are significant federal dollars that could come into our state that, from our perspective, could help generate new revenue, that could help provide additional support to our state budget. But that was not included in the report, probably for obvious reasons. But what was included was the need to get more federal dollars back to Kansas to help offset some of the state's cost. As we look at the tax-exempt status, out of the 127 hospitals that we have in Kansas, roughly 115 of them are not-for-profit hospitals that do receive the benefit of tax-exempt status under the state of Kansas. And so last year, as we were talking about how to get out of Topeka, or as the legislators were talking about how to get out of Topeka, one of the aspects that they brought up was that the state of Kansas had too many exemptions within our tax code. And so there was interest in taking a look at those and sunsetting those as of 2019. You may recall, many of you were engaged in this advocacy effort. We pushed back not only the hospitals, but many other industries about sunsetting those, because from our perspective, once you sunset those exemptions, it's very difficult to get them reinstated, because we don't know what we're going to be facing in 2019. We don't know what the budget situation will be. We don't know whether or not there will be competing interest in terms of trying to potentially reduce taxes further, and that might be an avenue that the legislature would go, rather than restoring the exemptions for Kansas hospitals. And so from our perspective, this was a very rural situation. As we look at this issue in 2016, and given the fact that the legislature is not looking at increasing taxes, and they're almost out of every option available for reducing expenditures, this is one issue that may percolate again because it could bring more revenue back into the state coffers. And so we will be watching this very closely to ensure that our interests are protected and that we can avoid, hopefully with your assistance and your help, any sunsetting of the exemptions for Kansas hospitals. There was an interim committee. To give you a little bit of background, at the conclusion of 2015, they established an interim committee. What this committee did was they brought in various stakeholders to talk about the need for exemptions and whether or not those were justified. Those discussions happened back on November 5th and 6th, and then on December 9th, the committee convened again to talk about recommendations, and they came up with a few recommendations. Most notably, they kicked the can away from their decision making and said, you know what, we're not going to make any decisions and make any indications that which groups should or should not get exemptions, but we're basically going to throw the ball back over to the standing tax committees and in essence let them know that they should develop a process to evaluate the current exemptions and also look at developing some measures in terms of whether or not those current exemptions are meeting the objectives and goals that were originally thought of as those exemptions were provided. In addition, a recommendation was provided to state that minimum standards should be developed for any new exemptions. This is something that they want to be able to have a litmus test so that if a new group comes in and says, we would like to have an exemption for A, B, and C organization, there would be some type of process in place to determine whether or not that exemption should be granted. But again, they went back to this whole recommendation of sunsetting the current exemptions as a way to create some urgency by the legislature and the many groups that receive these exemptions to have a serious discussion. From their perspective, without sunsetting these exemptions, there couldn't be a serious discussion that could happen in the tax committees. Whether or not this issue comes up again, I think there's a chance. It is something that I think we need to make it very clear and well known that this is not an option that should be on the table, especially for Kansas hospitals. I want to spend a few minutes now talking about the whole issue of expansion, and there's been a lot of activities that have been happening over the last several months. And just to give you a little bit of background on that. In our country now, we have 31 states, including Louisiana, that is moving forward with expansion. And so we have only 19 states that have not moved forward. In terms of some of the recent communications, many of you have saw this. There's been discussions from the governor's office. There's been discussions from providers across Kansas indicating that this is something that we should be looking at. Obviously, you've seen the discussions from our perspective. The Speaker of the House talked about the need of, in essence, that the issue down in Independence is not as serious as what maybe folks from Independence would suggest because there's another hospital located within that same county. I think the Speaker of the House probably doesn't fully recognize the importance of the hospital within those communities, and so we were concerned about some of his comments. And then obviously you have the Americans for Prosperity, which is the main group that faces opposition or promotes opposition to the whole issue of expansion. We've talked about that this issue is an issue for all hospitals, and I think that's something to stress about today as well, that expansion just doesn't only benefit urban hospitals, and it just doesn't only benefit rural hospitals, it benefits all hospitals and the patients that we serve, and that's what's illustrated with this chart up here as well. The public support is still out there from our perspective on expansion. Every public opinion poll that we've seen conducted, 62% in essence support expansion, and so the public support from the general public is still there as it relates to expansion.